Before moving over to talking with State of Hockey, because we had a nice conversation with him about really log jams and roadblocks for some of these young players in the Penguins organization. We want to discuss a little bit of news that came out yesterday. All the focus right now, when it comes to the Pittsburgh Penguins, is on Sidney Crosby's contract. But as we learned earlier this week, Crosby has no concerns. In fact, he used the word optimistic several times when describing whether or not he'd sign a contract before the October 9th puck drop against the New York Rangers. So with that on the verge of happening, based on what we've heard, the Penguins are reportedly set to shift their focus to Marcus Pettersson. According to David Pagnotta of the fourth period last night, quote, Sidney Crosby is the obvious priority for Pittsburgh, but after his new contract is finalized, the Penguins are expected to begin formal talks with Marcus Pettersson on an extension as well. Horwat, before we get into should they, shouldn't they, are you surprised that they're already looking to extend Marcus Pettersson before this season begins?
No, I don't think I'm too surprised. I believe whenever we were heading into the offseason, we were discussing the Crosby extension and a little quieter, a little shorter, and a little less detail. We were discussing the Marcus Pettersson extension as well, because it is something that very much, I believe, the Penguins want to have happen. They want to extend him for, I don't know what kind of term, because the Penguins are in such a weird limbo, but the Penguins want him around. He's filled the Brian Dumoulin role exponentially well by way of being a great defenseman, probably easily the best on the team. And he's playing with Marcus Pettersson, so his offensive numbers are kind of just taking a nice little bump by way of proximity. So he's done really well for himself these last couple of seasons, pulled himself out of trade discussions, pulled himself out of trade talks just a couple years ago, to being a much needed player in the organization and in the lineup. So I don't know what kind of deal he's gonna ask for. He'll probably ask for a lot. I don't know what kind of deal the team is going to look to give him. Again, the Penguins are in such a weird spot. It's tough to really guess. But if everything was sunshine, rainbows, and roses, it'd be a long-term deal. But with where things are right now, it could still be. It's just a bit more of a question mark. And the money doesn't matter. Pay that man whatever he wants. He's worth it.
As far as should they, though, when I look at the Penguins right now, obviously Kyle Dubas is trying to serve two masters, right? He's trying to serve the rebuild and the future of the Penguins. And as he said, close that gap between this contention window, which is close to closed, if not already closed, and the next contention window. He's trying to close that gap. So he's trying to serve that master of the rebuild, but he's also trying to serve the now. This summer, a lot of it was focused on the rebuild. This would be 100% focusing on the now. You do need to keep some players. I understand that. You want to make sure the team is still competitive right now, this season, 2024-25, because you have Crosby, you have Malkin, you have Letang, you have Carlson, and all of them are still playing at a very high level. But you are committed to so many players. So that's where I get a little bit, worried, because I like Marcus Pettersson. I think he is the best defensive defenseman that the Penguins had last year. He is easily going to be the best defensive defenseman they have this year, and probably for the next couple of years if he does stick around. But you're trying to avoid the fate that we saw the Chicago Blackhawks take on. You're trying to avoid the fate that we saw the Detroit Red Wings take on. And I feel like because of that, you have to trade Marcus Pettersson eventually, and extending him makes that much more difficult, because I understand you want to keep players around. He's probably the best at what he does on your team. And if you trade him, there's not really anybody that's going to be able to fill that role unless we see miraculous turnarounds from one of Matt Grzelcyk or Ryan Graves. So you're not going to be able to fill that role. But at the same time, you do need to use some of these trade pieces before they decrease in value entirely. You're not going to be able to do it with Brian Rust. He has a full no-move clause. You're unlikely to be able to do it with Rickard Rakell because of the season he had last year. Marcus Pettersson, outside of Jake Gensel, is the biggest trade piece the Penguins have had in the last half decade that they're actually going to be in a position to trade and not have it be ridiculous, right? They were never going to trade Malkin. They were never going to trade Letang. They were never going to trade Crosby. Pettersson is a name that, in my eyes, you should be looking to move at some point this season whenever the iron strikes the hottest. Not that I don't like him. Not that if he doesn't say, hey, I'll come back very cheap for a bridge deal, I would sign that deal. But again, like you mentioned, Marcus Pettersson is in a position where he is going to try to cash out. And I just don't think the Penguins, where they're currently at in their situation, are in a position to be able to give it to him.
Unless they can convince him that there is something good on the other side of the tunnel. You know what I mean? Unless Kyle Dubas can do a great job of convincing Marcus Pettersson that after these 2 years, after the Malkin contract is up, after he leaves, likely after Letang leaves as well, because that contract will then see a lighter clause on it if they trade him then if you can convince Marcus Pettersson that, hey, there is light at the end of the tunnel for that, there's good things happening. I mean, bringing in Roken McGroarty is a good start. Sidney Crosby will probably still be around. That's another good start. You got to convince him that, well, and he would be around. So you could tell him, hey, you'll be a number one defenseman on this team. Number 2 behind Erik Karlsson, but he'll be aging, so maybe you get that number 1 slide. That's what you kind of have to bill him on. Hey, we can promise you there will be good things happening at the end of the tunnel. We will still be competitive. Mm-hmm. And look at Roken McGroarty coming in. Like we just discussed all these prospects. Look what they can do. Here's how good they can be. And we're still adding. Even if we suck this year, another high draft pick that's going to come around maybe. Mm-hmm. Again, it's not ideal. It's a rough situation, and the timing doesn't line up for this sort of thing because you're right. Marcus Pettersson is probably looking to cash in. Probably for a long-term deal with the most money he can get. The Penguins aren't in a position to hand out deals like that. If you look at the offseason they had, especially not max 2 years for everybody. We'll see what they do, but if Kyle Dubas can convince Marcus Pettersson and his camp good things are coming down the line, then they'd have to pull through with it. But also, I'm sure Marcus Pettersson will make sure there's not a full no move or be quick to waive something if need be.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in Pettersson's situation, you mentioned the 2-year timeline. At the end of that 2-year timeline, Pettersson will be 30. Mm-hmm. So that is a factor into this. He hasn't won a Stanley Cup. I don't think he's won a playoff series. So if that is important to him, and he knows that he's going to have value around the league, maybe if he gets to free agency, which means if this takes long like the Gensel one did last year, maybe he looks at this and says, listen, if you're trying to sell me that bill of goods of take a lower deal, stick around for the rebuild, it's going to be good. You've built your career in Pittsburgh. If you're trying to sell him that bill of goods, he could also look at it and say, okay, but I'm not going to have team success. And I know that I can make more money because you're trying to get me on a cheaper deal. I know I can make more money on the open market because he will. I think that's a hard sell. But the one thing that I want to ask you, again, just plain and simple, should the Penguins be interested in re-signing Marcus Pettersson to an extension? Should they be doing this, or should they look at him the way I'm looking at him as their best trade chip going into the season?
I'm on the side of re-signing because I'm holding out that sort of hope that they can sell him on good things to come at the end of the tunnel. That whole spiel that I just went on, I'm kind of holding out hope that's what can happen for this team, for my own mentality and for the team itself.
So you're saying if he comes in at a reasonable number?
Yeah, which because he doesn't play that high-flying offensive style of defense, he should be able to. I don't know what reasonable is, especially cap's going up.
Yeah,
I mean,
cap is going up, but let me just throw this out to you. I put that projection out there earlier this summer, 6 years, $5.73 or $713 million per year. Do you sign him to that deal?
Was that the Dumoulin deal?
No. Okay. Dumoulin signed for, I believe, $4.1 million a year.
Of course he did.
Oh, of course, the cap
at the time.
That was 7 years ago, before the COVID situation and everything like that.
You know what? I think so. The cap is supposed to go up pretty quickly. And each passing season will continue to go up. Yeah, you got to increase the payment on Crosby, but I think I would, especially if you're able to get him especially if there's no clauses attached to that or slimmer clauses attached to that, where when we get to that at the end of that 2 years, all right, we actually have nothing at the end of the tunnel. Pick a team. Here you go. But because he's gonna play worth it almost. It's not crossing 6, and that's kind of where I think that the ceiling would be for something like this.
I'm not worried about him performing, even though he will be at the end of that deal 34. I'm not as worried about him performing, and I'm not as worried about the actual contract details. What I'm worried about is what I mentioned to start this entire thing off. Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh doesn't want to become the third member of that, right? Detroit was great in the 2000s, one of the best teams that we've seen, and they sucked for, 10 years? They still haven't made it back to the playoffs. Chicago is in the same boat. 2015, they got there. They won. Since then, nothing. That's going on 10 years of nothing, and they are nowhere close. Are you really, the more players you do this with, the longer it's going to take to get back. And again, I have faith in Kyle Dubas in this rebuilding process, but you can't hold on to all of your chips. You can't do it. Eventually, you have to trade him. He was forced into trading Gensel last year. I thought he got a good package. I thought he helped accelerate the rebuild a little bit, or at least kick off, not accelerate. That was the kickoff. I think you have to at least keep it open to doing the same with Pettersson. So that's where I stand. I like Pettersson. I'd love to see him stick around. I'd love to see him be able to usher in a new generation of defensive defensemen for the Penguins. But where the Penguins stand right now, they might be 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But with a guy like Pettersson, you need to be 10 toes down into, hey, you're going to be on the trade market this year, not because we don't like you, but because that's what the organization calls for, and that's where our current situation is. Again, other people might disagree, but I think the Penguins are in a position where, while it'd be nice to have a guy like Pettersson around, it's better to try to expedite the rebuild a little bit more, close that gap a little bit more, and be able to get what I would expect is a very hefty package for Pettersson, depending on what time of the year the actual trade is made and what time of the year his stock is the highest.
Yeah, and to go on a point that you mentioned there of how you don't want to keep all your chips around, the beauty is, in my head, Pettersson might be the only one I want to keep around. Malkin, we know, is going to leave anyway. I just said they might trade Letang in 2 years. I've been trying to bang on the trade Ricardo Keldrum for multiple seasons now. Brian Rust, once that trade clause elevates a bit, maybe they make that decision. It's tough, but maybe you make that decision. The entire bottom 6, except for Drew O'Connor, might not even be here in 2 seasons. And, I mean, they would have traded Graves if they could have found a taker. So, in my head, at least going off of that point, yeah, the Penguins aren't keeping all their chips. It's that one and Sidney Crosby. So to those 2.
Yeah, here's the problem. Those other chips are stale as hell. If I'm trying to trade Malkin, you're not getting anything back for. He's retiring and walking into the sunset, which fine. He has the right to do so. But that's not helping you rebuild. That's back anything in exchange. The only piece, I mean, Brian Rust, like you mentioned, whenever his trade clause goes down, he's going to be what, 34, 35?
Something like that.
Our other team's going to be, here's a 6th round pick. Well, that's great. Can't wait to take a jump on a 6th round pick and eventually hope he turns into something. No, the one piece that you have that is worth of actual value that can actually bring in multiple assets to help your rebuild is Marcus Pettersson. It's the only one. I mean, Crosby is, but that's not happening. Not now, not ever. If I'm Kyle Dubas, Marcus Pettersson's that one. And that is the chip that, listen, you might want to keep him, but it is going to be much better for your organization's future if you're able to shop him and get a good deal for him. Again, don't take any deal, but I think his value this year is going to get high enough, especially if he's on an expiring deal, that you're going to be able to get a good bit for him. Now, if you can extend him and still trade him, best case scenario, because you're getting more because you're selling a future for other teams. But as he goes into the season, I would not extend him with a thought process of keeping him personally. But that's where we differ, and that's fine. Yeah. Let us know in the comment section. What would you do? Would you extend Marcus Pettersson, or would you use him as a trade chip in the 2024-25 season? Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, joined by State of Hoppy of the Soda Pod, breaking down the Penguins roster, some of these roadblocks, some of these hurdles that these young guys have to go over. A great conversation with State of Hoppy right after this.